minutes, 15 seconds. Dot one. Since 1980, the American economy has doubled in size. But adjusting for inflation, most people's wages have barely increased. Second dot. Where did all that money go? Almost all the gains have gone to the super rich. The top 1% used to take home about 10% of total income. Now it takes home more than 20%. And the super rich have 40% of the nation's entire wealth. The third dot. All this money at the top has given the super rich lots of political power, especially power to lower their tax rates. Before 1980, the top tax rate was over 70%. Now it's down to 35%. And much of their income is capital gains, subject to only a 15% tax. According to the IRS, the richest 400 Americans pay only 17%. Fourth dot. This means huge budget deficits. Tax revenues are down to less than 15% of the total economy, the lowest in 60 years. So public services are being cut at all levels of government. Our kids are being crowded into classrooms with more and more other children. Roads, bridges, levees, healthcare, safety nets, they're all being sacrificed. The fifth dot. Instead of joining together for better wages and jobs, many people are so scared that they're competing with other working people for the scraps that are left behind. So we get union versus non-union, public employee versus private, native-born versus immigrants. Final dot. The vast middle class, unable to borrow as it could before, no longer has the purchasing power needed to get the economy growing again, which means continued high unemployment and an anemic recovery. So you see the big picture? The only way we can have a strong economy is with a strong middle class.
It is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce a man who really needs no introduction. Many of you probably remember Robert B. Reich from his prominent role as Secretary of Labor in the Clinton administration. Or, if you're really a Washington insider, you may also recall his service in the Ford and Carter administrations. However, my first real introduction to Professor Reich was not through his government service or in one of his classrooms at Brandeis or Harvard universities. Instead, there's somebody from Brandeis in the house. Instead, my relationship with Professor Reich and his ideas began in the fall of 1993 when I arrived as a newly minted graduate student in Purdue University's Department of Political Science. One of my very first assignments was to read and critique Professor Reich's book, The Work of Nations. I recall being captured by his compelling analysis of the global economic shifts that were changing U.S. society and the world, and his assessments of the type of skilled workers that would be needed in this new economy. We were also assigned to read his edited volume, The Power of Public Ideas, and through this conversation among thinkers, it opened up my own thoughts about the reasons why and the vehicles through which people seek to influence politics and policy. Indeed, although I have never actually just today met Professor Reich, and I've never sat in his class, I can proudly say that I consider myself his student. A prolific writer, deep thinker, and gifted analyst, Professor Reich's blogs, articles, and books have done a lot, not only to sound the alarm about what ails our society, but also to provide solutions about how to right our economy and save our democracy. His latest book, Aftershock, The Next Economy in America's Future, is a case in point. In it, Reich discusses the structural reasons underlying the global financial crisis, illustrating how the American middle class's standard of living has fallen as a result of wage stagnation, household debt, and the concentration of wealth at the very top of the economic ladder. He also provides policy prescriptions, including higher tax rates for the wealthy. Can we say higher tax rates for the wealthy? as a way to promote shared prosperity in the new economy. Just in case you didn't know it, Professor Reich currently serves as the Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy at the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. And you should know that Time magazine named him one of the 10 most effective secretaries of the century. Now, Professor Rice points out that was last century, but I would beg to differ that it's this century as well. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a proper welcome to the one of the greatest contemporary thinkers of modern American life, Professor Robert B. Reich.
Thank you. As you can see, the economy has worn me down. Five years ago, I was 6'4". No, it's also, you know, I've also been worn down by the radical right. But I'll tell you something, I am growing back. You know, in this country, there's always been a kind of tension between two great forces. One is the progressive force that is inclusive and tolerant and stands for equal opportunity and assumes that the nation is a community in which we all have responsibilities for one another. And on the other side is the regressive force that takes the opposite position on all of these. Instead of it being inclusive, the nation under the regressive regime is exclusive and intolerant. Instead of equal opportunity, it's unequal opportunity and widening inequality. Instead of us being all together in which everybody's fate is interdependent, we are all on our own. And let me tell you something. The progressive forces always win out over the regressive forces. Now, you've got to, right now, here, there are two strategies, the two basic strategies the regressive radical right is using. We've got to understand them in economic terms, and we've got to spread the truth about the economy. And this is vitally important because, you know, it's like the big lie. George Orwell and others understood the big lie. What is the big lie? The big lie is if you state it over and over and over again, even though it's absurd. If you state it over and over and over again on Fox News, on radical Yale radio, Rush Limbaugh, if you state it over and over again on the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal, state it over and over again, people start believing it because they say to themselves, oh, well, I keep hearing that. Unless there is a strong rebuttal, unless the truth is told firmly and loudly, the lies take over. And it is our responsibility to make sure the truth get out. And in terms of the economy, there are a lot of lies. They're big lies. They're whoppers. I mean, the lie, for example, the lie I keep hearing is that corporations need tax relief, tax cuts, and also less regulation in order to create jobs. Now, my friends, corporations in America are now sitting on $2 trillion of cash. The ratio of corporate profits to wages has never been as high since before the Great Depression. For anybody to argue that corporations need more money, they need higher profits, they need fewer taxes. They need less regulation, health, safety, environmental, protecting small investors. For anybody but argue that corporations with more money will create jobs when they're not creating jobs now with all the money they have is not looking at reality, is either a fool or a knave. Or take another. I mean, the idea that we need to provide wealthy people in this country with more tax cuts, or we cannot raise taxes on people at the top because that would in some way interfere with job growth, is just the repeat of the same trickle-down economics we've had now for 30 years. And here's what we know about trickle-down economics. It doesn't work. It is a fraud. It is not trickle-down economics. It is trickle-on economics. I mean, George W. Bush cut taxes on the wealthy. What happened? Fewer jobs were created than created under the Clinton administration, far fewer, 1/3 as many. And on top of that, median wages, the average worker, and by the way, there's a difference between average and median. Whenever you hear any report that says average wages are going up, watch your wallets. The basketball player Shaquille O'Neal and I have an average height of 6'3". You get my drift? You see, averages pull up the data. I mean, you don't want to look at the average. Look at the median. Median, that is the person who's right smack in the middle, an equal number above, equal number below. Median wages are trending downward, have trended downward since the Bush tax cut. No trickle down. In fact, trickle on, trickle down economics is a fraud. And then you have them, the radical right, the regressives, who are saying, well, wait a minute, if you raise taxes on small businesses, they will not create. You know how many small businesses and small business owners are in the top tax bracket? Fewer than 2%. And you know something? We're only talking about the percentage of their income that is over the margin for the top tax bracket. I mean, this is an absurd argument that is being used by those with power and those who are privileged in our society to mask and retain and entrench their own power and privilege. Or you have people, now this is a doozy. Wait for this one. You hear this over and over. If we shrink government, we're going to create jobs. Now, this is a very interesting issue. I mean, how do you create more jobs if you're firing teachers, firefighters, police officers, if you're firing social workers? How do you create more jobs if you are putting out of business all of the people who were government contractors on roads and bridges and rebuilding the infrastructure and rebuilding our schools? How do you create jobs if you actually, at a time when consumers who are deathly scared about not meeting their mortgage payments and their bills, consumers whose wages are going down and who are losing their jobs, consumers who are actually looking at their major asset, their homes, and they see that major asset worth 1/3 less than it was worth 5 years ago, consumers are not going to go into the shops and buy. So the real problem of the economy is that consumers who are 70%, their spending is 70% of the total national economy. If consumers, average working people, cannot and will not, they are not able to purchase, obviously businesses are not going to hire. And if they are not able to purchase and businesses are not going to hire, where do you get the demand in the system to keep the system going? You go to the one institution that is the purchaser of last resort, and that is the government. And right now, when you've got 25 million Americans looking for full-time work, right now, when you've got an infrastructure, roads, bridges, highways, ports, airports, Public transportation, water, sewer systems, everything else you can imagine, school buildings. Right now, when you've got all of that crumbling because of deferred maintenance, and right now, when interest rates on the 10-year Treasury bill are under 2%, making it so cheap for the United States to borrow, right now, put those three dots together, and anyone with half a brain understands that now is the time to borrow to put Americans to work rebuilding America. But apparently, there are not enough people in Washington in power with even half a brain. I mean, I could go on with the lies. Social Security is the biggest problem for the budget. Now, come on. Social Security is rising in the out years, but Social Security is not a problem. Social Security is not a Ponzi scheme. I used to be a trustee of the Social Security Trust Fund. Social Security is fine for the next 26 years, and it would be fine for a century if you lifted the ceiling on the proportion of income subjected to Social Security taxes. The regressive forces in America, they say Medicare has got to be cut. Medicare is the big problem in the future in terms of the debt. Wrong. Medicare is not the problem. Medicare, in terms of the administrative costs of Medicare relative to private insurance, Medicare is the solution. In fact, allow Medicare to use its bargaining leverage to let lower drug prices and lower medical supply prices and lower hospital prices. Let Medicare use its bargaining leverage to move from a fee-for-service system to a fee-for-healthy outcome system, and we actually control medical costs and get good results for every American. We need Medicare. We need Medicare for all. And you've got some people on the extreme right, the regressive forces, they say, believe me, they say corporations are people. Now you've got the Supreme Court. In one of the worst decisions in Supreme Court history, I mean, it's right up there with Dred Scott and Bush against Gore and Plessy against Ferguson. I mean, these are the shameful, this is the hall of shame in terms of Supreme Court decisions. The Supreme Court, in Citizens United against Federal Election Commission, the Supreme Court says corporations are people entitled to First Amendment rights. Corporations are legal fictions, my friends. They are legal fictions. I'll believe that a corporation is a person when Texas and Georgia start executing corporations. In fact, even then, I'm not sure I'm going to believe the verdict. You see, a lot of those on the right say the budget deficit is the most important thing we can deal with right now. No. The biggest crisis we have in America right now, the biggest crisis since the Great Depression, is not the budget deficit. It's jobs and wages. Jobs and wages. Jobs and wages. And let me tell you the logic of this, because there is a logic behind what I am saying. You see, the real issue in the out years, anybody who's concerned about the budget deficit, the real issue years from now is the ratio of the debt to the total economy. Debt versus GDP. Now, the only way you really get that ratio down is you build the economy, you build jobs. That is step number one. If you don't do that, that ratio gets worse and worse and worse. So before you do anything, before you start cutting, before you start doing anything with regard to the budget deficit, what you need to do, number one, is jobs and wages and growth. That's what you've got to get done first. And we've got to spread that understanding. Because it's, you know, the president says it's a matter of math, and it is a matter of math. But it's also a matter of morals. You know, right now, 37% of families with young children in America are in poverty. That's the highest percent we've seen since records have been kept. 37% of American families with young children are in poverty. And yet, we have now at the top 1%, raking in over 20% of total national income per year. That is higher than it's been since 1928. And we've got the top 1% with 35% of total wealth in this country. That's the highest it's been since 1922. You see, what the radical right, the regressive forces in America, you see what they're doing, where they want to take us? They want to take us back to the 1920s, or back to the 1880s, 1890s, the Gilded Age, or back to the Stone Age. And we cannot let them. The weapon that they are using is not just the big lie. The weapon they are using is also demoralization and cynicism. In other words, I can't tell you how many people come up to me, you know, because I am very short and pretty obvious. People who I don't know come up to me in airports and they say, "Yeah, you were what's your name? You were George Stephanopoulos." I don't know. They can never remember. But they say, but they look at me and they know that I was part of the Clinton administration and they say, "Isn't it awful?" Or they say to me, "How are we going to survive? How are we going to make it?" Or on streets, they come up to me and they say, "My family is really hurting." Or they say, "Have you ever seen anything this bad?" And after tens or 20s or hundreds of people come up to me like this, I tell you, it can get a little bit demoralizing. But the worst thing is when people say nothing can be done. But when people say nothing can be done, when they were so cynical about the ability to change the direction of the country, then we know the other side is won. Their number one weapon is to so discredit government, so discredit the capacity of us working together through the institutions of government given to us by the Constitution and the Founding Fathers, so discredit them. I mean, whether it's lies about weapons of mass destruction, or it's the response to Katrina, or it's a huge fiasco over raising the debt limit, should never have been even an issue. But you see, it paints it all in America's mind as a fiasco, as government doesn't work any longer. Government is for the big guys. Government is for the powerful. It's for the privileged. I no longer have any say. I cannot do anything about it. And that demoralization and that cynicism is their biggest weapon, because if people really believe nothing can change and they can have no part in changing it, then that is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that is why so much of what we do, so much of what you do, so much of taking back the American dream is taking back our power and confidence in that power. You see, people, you know, right now, there are demonstrations all over this country, on Wall Street, 70 other cities. 70 cities. And you know, And if you listen to the media, first of all, the media are not even playing it. But if they are, what are they saying? Well, this is a movement. It's not really a movement. There's no direction. There's no head. There's nothing. They don't have a plan. Let me tell you something. These demonstrations are the small tip of an iceberg. They are an iceberg of discontent. And I say, demonstrate like mad. Because that wakes up others to the possibility of change. Now, when Barack Obama was elected, I was one of those who supported him, and I was delighted. I mean, I couldn't believe it. He walked in. I had a meeting of his advisors shortly after he was elected in Chicago. He walked in the room, and I could barely contain myself. He walked around to all of his advisors, shook their hands. He came to me, and I actually started crying. I felt like such an asshole. I mean, here's the new president of the United States, and I was a blithering idiot. But I was crying because of him. And I was also crying because a black man had become president of the United States. And like many of you, I'm not content. I wish he had done much more. I don't like the fact that he has compromised or tried to compromise with the other side, because there's no compromising with the other side. But let me tell you this. I've been in Washington enough to know that you can have the best people here, but if people outside Washington are not organized and mobilized and energized in a continuing basis, nothing good happens here. When all those people come up to me and say, oh, it's awful what's going on in Washington, you know what I say back? I say, what are you doing about it? What are you doing about it? Because I think that many of us, have let President Obama down. I think that if we were more, and if we are in the future after today, more mobilized and more energized and better organized and pushing harder, we will get what Americans need to get. And that is the heart of taking back the American dream. Now, I've got just one more thing to say, and then I'm going to turn it over to you and your questions. You want me to just continue on? No. I just got one more thing to say, and this is important. Remember when I opened by talking about the progressive forces and the regressive forces in America, and how the progressive forces always win? Well, my first entree into, and the sheriff of Neshoba County and others took Mickey out of his car, and two others, one black and a white, took the three of them and tortured them and murdered them. And when the man who had been my protector from the bullies was tortured and killed by the bullies, who wanted to prevent black people from voting, I said to myself, the most important thing any of us can do is to protect the powerless, to make sure that the people with power, the people with privilege, we're not going to use their power and privilege to bully anybody, and to give ordinary working people and the poor a voice so that they would not be bullied ever again. And that But here is where my confidence comes from. Here is where my confidence comes from. The progressive forces, well, look, what happened? The civil rights struggle and the anti-Vietnam struggle. What happened? The darkest days in the 1950s with regard to McCarthyism and the blacklists. What happened with regard to the Great Depression and the Second World War? Every time this country has really been challenged, every time the regressive forces look like they are going to win, the progressive forces rally. That's been the history. That is the history of the United States. A history 2 steps forward, 1 step back. A history of progressive forces fighting the regressive forces, but ultimately winning out because Americans in their hearts are not just progressive, but they are sensible. If they understand the truth, and that is a big if, but it is more a when they understand the truth, we roll up our sleeves and get on with what has to be done. This terrible jobs and wage depression, and it is a depression, continues for most Americans. There is a small group that doesn't want to do anything about it, that rejects any common sense solution, that just says no. The nabobs of negativism. But Americans are not going to stand for it. We are going to say to those with power and privilege, no more bullying. Thank you. Okay. So now, it's time for your questions, not your speeches. You see, when I'm in front of a wonderful, wonderful group of people like you, you have a lot to say. But if we want to have time for your questions and my answers, we got to say no speeches. All right? Is that okay with you? Okay. Okay. And I apologize in advance. So we're going to have questions, just questions, and no speeches, and then answers. And if I don't have an answer for your question, I'll just make up a question and then I'll answer it. And I'll repeat your question. So let's start with this gentleman right here.
Can you tell us how to get rid of the bully power of the filibuster?
Can I tell you how?
To get rid of the bully power of the filibuster.
Oh. How to get the bullies out of the filibuster? Well, look, one of the things that has to be done is to get rid of the filibuster altogether. The Founding Fathers, let's be clear about this. The Founding Fathers did not put the filibuster in the Constitution. There was no provision in the Constitution that says you've got to have 60 votes in the Senate in order to get anything through the Senate. There's no provision in the Constitution that says the people in the House of Representatives can threaten to close government down and even threaten the full faith and credit of the United States if they don't get their way. The Constitution does not contemplate that. The Founding Fathers did not contemplate it. Let's get back. You want to be conservative? You want to be really conservative? You want to go back to the Founding Fathers? Then go back there and let's have a real democracy. And by the way, unfortunately, the Founding Fathers did not contemplate the kind of democracy we should have in every respect. Yes. What can we do about Citizens United is the question. Well, here's what we can do about Citizens United. We can dedicate ourselves to making sure that when one of those 5 justices who voted for that outrageous Citizens United case either retires or leaves or dies, that he or she is replaced, it is he, is replaced with somebody who is absolutely committed to overturning and overruling Citizens United. And that means, at the very least, in fact, it means definitely, we have got to have Barack Obama president of the United States so that he can make sure that we get decent Supreme Court justices in there. Yes. How do we get decent people to run for office so we can get these jerks, that was what you said, out of there? Look, how many of you have run for office? How many of you have run for political office? Okay, keep your hands up and let's everybody else applaud the people who have run for office. It is no fun, in most cases, to run for office. It is very hard. I ran for governor of Massachusetts in 2002. Had I won, this is out of 6 Democratic candidates, I came in a close second. If I had won, I'd run against the Republican nominee who was Mitt Romney. I would have whipped his ass. And if he becomes president, I have nobody but me to blame. But let me tell you something seriously, and that is, I had been around politicians my whole life, but I learned by doing it to respect politicians much, much more. Anybody who runs for office knows how difficult it is. You've got to kiss ass. You've got to, yeah, a lot of it. You've got to raise money. You've got to really deal with people who are very demanding, and you've got to explain reality in ways where the burden of proof is against you because they are saying to you, well, why should I vote for you? And when people are scared, and this is true now, when people are scared, they are fertile ground for demagogues who want to come along and use the politics of resentment to blame scapegoats, to blame immigrants, to blame the poor, to blame minorities, to blame foreigners, to blame Europeans, the French. Do you remember that? To blame unionized workers, to blame government workers, to blame public employees. The politics of blame knows no end. So I say to you, run. Do it again. Keep, in your 4th term? You were in your 4th term? Where are you in your 4th term? Where? New Hampshire House of Representatives. That is marvelous. By the way, I spent many of my formative years in New Hampshire. And New Hampshire, the New Hampshire House of Representatives is one of the largest legislative bodies in the world. In fact, it's the only state where every family has a representative. No, that's not true, is it? Okay, other questions? Yes.
I have a mic, so everyone will be able to hear you.
Yeah.
I'm Crazy Kay from Kansas, and I'm wanting to go back. I'm wanting to go back to Kansas and really hit the ground running with my group of Move On community. What do you recommend should be our top priority right now in the economics, in the jobs? What would you do if you went back to Kansas?
I think, as I said, I think the top priority in the short term, in the very short term, is to get the jobs bill enacted. That's the #1 short-term priority. But right behind that jobs bill priority is to create enough pressure, enough organizing, mobilizing, energizing of the base, whether we're talking about the Democratic base or the progressive base or Americans overall as a base, to get a bigger jobs bill, a more powerful jobs bill, and also to avoid some of the crazy cuts that are going to happen. I mean, what's going to happen now? You've got a super committee that is going to report back in not that many weeks. And if it comes up with cuts, you know that a lot of those cuts are going to be in domestic, non-defense discretionary spending. And even if they don't agree, the automatic trigger is going to trigger cuts in non-defense domestic discretionary. Now, I ask you, I said before, 37% of American families with young children are in poverty. Where are the federal programs that help that 37% in non-defense domestic discretionary? And I haven't even said anything about the state cuts and the local cuts. You know, it's like a cascade downward of cuts. I mean, what's happening at the local level, you know, you people in your towns, you know what's happening. Teachers being fired, school days being shortened, social workers being fired, family services being cut. Why? The local governments can't do it. They say we're not getting any aid from the states. The state governments say we can't do it. We're not getting any help from the federal government. That cascade downward is not being told. That story is not being told. You need to tell that story. Yes, sir.
Is it on? Okay. I'm David Cooper, Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and I'm a college professor like you, only I teach philosophy. I need data. You talked about scapegoats a minute ago. I get so many students who tell me they're tired of welfare mothers getting all this help when in Upper Peninsula they're struggling for jobs. So they're scapegoating. But you gave us data earlier on the transfer of wealth since the Reagan era in terms of the 1%. Do you have any data on what it's been like for welfare mothers in that same period of time?
I'm sorry, data on? Yeah. What's happened, you know, ever since so-called welfare reform in 1996, we had a replacement of welfare reform, so-called, with a 5-year lifetime entitlement. 5-year lifetime. Now that's okay as long as you don't have a lot of big, long recessions, but what we are now seeing is that a lot of those people who are very poor in our society are exhausting that 5-year lifetime because the Great Recession is actually a great jobs and wage depression for a large portion of the population, and that started in about 2008 for most people. It is now 2011, 8, 9, 10, 11. You see how many people are getting to the end. Here's another related issue. Employment benefits, unemployment benefits, that so many people are relying on. Unemployment benefits, at best, reach 40% of the unemployed. You see, 60% of the people who have lost their jobs don't get any unemployment benefits at all. In Congress, they're saying, we don't want to extend unemployment benefits. You know, I talked to some of the radical conservatives in Congress. They say, we're not going to extend unemployment benefits, because if you extend unemployment benefits, people would rather stay not working than they would working. Now, when there are actually right now it is 4.3 people looking for work for every job opening, how can you say that if you extend unemployment benefits, you are going to encourage people not to work? Right now, the safety nets of America are torn and shredded at a time when we need them to be strong and solid more than ever before. And so one of the additional things to organize around is to make sure that when people fall out, and a lot of people are falling out right now, it's not just the poor, it is the middle class, everybody is falling through the cracks, make sure that there's enough of a safety net there so that they can bounce back. This is critically important, and it's good for the economy too. This is not just a matter of generosity. Because if they don't have any money in their pockets, they can't buy the food and the clothing and everything else they need to buy to keep the private sector going and to keep jobs. You see, we're all in it together. Yes, oh, there is actually a queue, a line there. I didn't see you. Yes, please, go ahead.
Secretary Reich, thanks so much for your passion and your heart this afternoon. I think it's vital that we all leave here with a common message, that which conservatives have had since, let's say, Goldwater, reducing government. Government is bad. I'd like to try on you something that I've been thinking about, and please give me your understanding on framing, what your frame would be. And my frame is the common good versus corporate greed, or the public good, that which we pay for with our taxes, versus private greed.
Well, another way of saying that is something that Al Gore said in the last month of his campaign in 2000. You know, Al Gore, the person who won the presidential election in 2000? And in that last month, his ratings started to go up because he started to talk about a reality that many people understood in the depths of their being, and that is the people versus the powerful. The people versus the powerful. It is nothing wrong in having a lot of money in this country, but there is a lot of wrong in abusing that money. And you see, if you're looking for a way of framing, another way of saying it is the regressive forces, they really envision America as a society in which each person is on his own or her own. But in reality, we are all in it together. Even the very rich would do better with a smaller share of a rapidly growing economy than they would with a large share of an economy that's dead in the water. You see, we knew this as a country. You know, people come up to me skeptically. They say, wait a minute, what country would you recommend we emulate? And you know, the people who ask me this always think I'm going to say Sweden or Denmark, and they're going to sneer. But you know what I say to them, in all sincerity? I say, we emulate the United States between 1946 and 1978. That was an economy that grew for everybody. It was an economy and a society in which we actively sought to expand the circle of prosperity, in which we struggled for civil rights and voting rights, in which we struggled for equal opportunity for all people, regardless of their race or their creed or their sexual orientation or their gender. It was a society in which, as productivity went up, everybody's wages went up. There was a lot wrong, but we tried to mend it. And then what happened in 1980, 81, 82? Productivity continued to go up, but wages flattened. And what happened to all the money? It went to the top. What happened to all the power? It went with the money to the top. That's the simple and true story. Other questions? Oh, we still have a queue there. Yes.
What do you think about combining two of the proposals we have here, which is the Curb Wall Street by a transaction tax, with the Rebuild America, which is where we need to spend money, so that we combine, because as you know, if you don't have a dedicated revenue stream in government, it goes away, whatever the program is. And the second thing, part of that is, what do you think about getting the Congress off the hook for raising our taxes by putting it as a national referendum?
First of all, let me just say something very loud and very clearly, and I want you to remember this. The other side, that is the regressive forces, want to spread a mythology that we are poor, that we're a poor nation. The reality is we are a rich nation. We are the richest country in the world. We are richer than we have ever been in our history. The idea that we are poor, that we can't afford to do what we must do for our poor, for our middle class in terms of education, infrastructure, the idea that we have got to sit back and allow people to have as much pain as they are enduring in this great recession, this jobs depression, is absurd. It is immoral and is scandalous. So don't fall for the idea that we are poor. The second thing, in terms of how do we pay for, well, yes. A small 1/2 of 1% financial transaction tax would generate $200 billion a year. Europe is doing it. Europe is now moving toward a transaction tax. They say, and Europeans agree, they say we are in trouble financially, and we're in trouble financially in part because we bailed out the big banks. And so it is appropriate that we have a small transaction tax, 1/2 of 1%. It's a rounding error. I mean, you know, Wall Street would not even see it. But it would generate $200 billion a year, yes. And let's dedicate that toward rebuilding America. But there's something else. What about something else that we could easily do if we had the political will to do it? And that is a 2% surcharge on wealth over $7 million. Now, a 2% surcharge on wealth over $7 million. Now, this is not, we're not talking about the average person here. Okay, I want to make that clear. We're talking about the people who are not even the top 1%, the top 1/2 of 1%. A 2% surcharge would yield $70 billion a year. Can you imagine what that would do for our schools? For our young people? For the future of America? So yes, we can afford it. It is not a question of affordability. It's a question of will and organizing, and it's a question of making sure the American people know the truth. Thank you. What did she say? Oh, we have time for one more question. Well, let me just ask you. This is a personal favor since it's the last question. I want a doozy of a question. I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I want a question that enables me to summarize everything I've said and provide a kind of a rhetorical expression of just rousing spirit. But you've got to ask the right question. Again, no pressure at all. Yeah, go ahead.
Nice try. What can we do ourselves and force our governments to do to genuinely help small businesses? Because we don't.
How can you hear? Why is it that you can hear and I can't? Oh. What can we do to help small businesses create jobs?
And force the government to, too.
Yeah, okay. Look, one of the conditions that should have been laid down at the feet of Wall Street when we bailed out Wall Street, one of those conditions should have been you help families reorganize their mortgages. Number two, you make sure that there's enough lending to small businesses so small businesses can expand. Number three, you make sure that you, Wall Street, as a condition for getting this money, agree to resurrecting the Glass-Steagall Act, separating investment from commercial banking. Small banks and small businesses in America are in trouble now. The best thing we can do to help small banks and to small businesses is to make sure there's enough money in the pockets of average working people and the poor so that they can go to small businesses. And the small businesses can thereby go to banks and expand. And you see, that's why it comes back to the demand side of the equation, not to the supply side. Whenever you hear somebody using supply side methodology or supply side thinking says, look, it is the big businesses, and it is Wall Street, and it is the rich. They are the ones who supply the jobs and the innovation and everything else in America. What you need to do is stop them in mid-sentence and say, you supply-siders have been proven wrong for the last 30 years. Here's what we know. It is the demand side, because it is aggregate demand. It is ordinary people. It is working people that are the center of this economy. And we've got to get them working again. And we've got to get their wages up. And we've got to make them more powerful. And not only do we need a stimulus that is big enough, but we also have to tackle this huge and growing curse of widening inequality, because as the rich get richer, the vast middle class and the poor and the working class, we used to call them, don't have enough purchasing power to keep the economy going. And as the rich get richer, we have more speculation, more booms and busts. And as the rich get richer, some of the rich, like the Koch brothers, abuse their wealth and they corrupt the political process. And so we've got to deal with all of that together. And the only way we can deal with all of that together is if we, all of us, dedicate ourselves to this movement, to taking back the American dream. Thank you.